Hey, hey, hey. Thanks for tuning in to Fintech Quotient. I am Raunak, Dembla, your guide through India's vibrant fintech scene. From the hustle and bustle of Mumbai to tech parks in Bengaluru and swanky offices in Delhi, we will explore the stories of entrepreneurs shaping the future of fintech. Whether you're an industry veteran or new to the fintech world, we've got something for you. Let's get started with today's episode of Fintech Quotient's Spotlight series. This podcast is powered by Pixel and Pros, the one-stop solution for all your premium digital marketing needs. In today's episode, we are in conversation with Movin Jain, the founder of Skydo, a cross-border B2B payments company. Movin is a prominent figure in the product community, having led product at PhonePe and worked at companies like Meesho, Ola, and InMobi previously. Movin and I have known each other for a while now through the fintech and product community. However, I got to understand him after this conversation. Movin strikes me as a person who is very deliberate in everything he does. Throughout this conversation, you will see instances where he thinks deeply before making a move. I am super excited to spotlight Movin and his journey in this episode. Let's dive in. Hey Movin, super excited to have you on the show.
Hi Raunak, great to be here and thanks for doing this podcast with me.
Right from shopping to payments, I think you covered the entire loop. So is there like any particular reason that you chose cross-border payments after having seen UPI and the kind of success that PhonePe and UPI have seen?
I think a few years back when I had spent a few years in Ola, Meesho and a few other startups, I was thinking about the impact of my work and in general what kind of space I wanted to be in. And being a techie at heart, I always was looking for something where tech was center stage and you didn't need people or objects moving on the ground to be able to create impact for customers. And e-commerce and mobility, of course, happen to be heavily operational intensive businesses. I felt maybe there's another world where this doesn't happen and you just deploy code and users get value. That's what the techie inside me was telling me to look for. Then I wasn't even sure if something like that actually exists or it's just my imagination. But then as I was speaking to people in my network and getting advice from some of my mentors, I came across a few sectors where something like this could actually happen. Fintech and particularly payments was one, gaming was another, and social networking was another. So then I proactively, for the first time in my life, started looking at job search by selection and not by elimination and started actively chasing companies in these sectors. And then among the opportunities I got, luckily, PhonePe was one and I was really excited by them and their culture and what they were building. So joined them, spent a couple of years there leading payments. And that's where I learned a lot about payments and about fintech. From the outside, payments seems very simple. I'm sure you'll agree with me. Whereas at the inside, it couldn't be more complicated than it is. So that's when I got fascinated and I realized one, tech can do so much and create so much impact in this space. And two, it can touch so many lives. See if I could start my next company in payments and in fintech. So a combination of these two factors sort of led me to think about starting up in payments. Then Srivatsan, who's my co-founder, he's been a close friend for the last many years. He was actually my boss at Ola. And having a drink together a couple of years back. And during the conversation, just came out that both of us at some point wanted to start up. And fintech was a subject of affinity for both because he was also at true peak at that time. So we said, why not start spending some of our weekends to brainstorm and see if we can actually build something together. And as we thrashed through a few different ideas within fintech and within payments, cross-border payments came to the fore due to, I would say, the intersection of our different experiences and professional as well as personal. Eventually, we decided to quit our jobs respectively and start a company together.
That's quite an interesting journey. So, Mohan, you spoke about cross-border payments. I think the natural evolution to this conversation would be to break down cross-border payments for our listeners. And what exactly is it? And for somebody who's not aware of anything to do with cross-border payments, how can we simplify this for them?
So, of course, cross-border payments is self-explanatory as a term, but within this, there are different purposes and different kinds of cross-border payments. So one way to segregate is by purpose, and the other way to segregate is by who's sending and who's receiving the payment. So if you at a high level section it by purpose, then there could be capital account payments and current account payments.
Right.
Capital account means I'm, let's say, based in China and I'm lending some money to you and you're based in, say, Indonesia. So that's a cross-border payment, but it's a capital account payment and I'm expecting to get paid back or get interest from you on this loan. Then let's say I am based in India and I'm selling some goods. Let's say I'm running a D2C brand and you're a customer in Europe who came to my website and bought something. So you're going to make a cross-border payment to me, which is paying me for those goods.
Yeah.
So that's current account payment, because there it's typical buying or selling of goods and services. Similarly, when Indians invest in the US market through IND money and a lot of these other products, that's a capital account payment because you're investing in equity and so on. So that's at a high level a very simple way to divide cross-border payments between current and capital account. Now, Skydo is focusing on current account payments, and that then also happens to be the area which I know more about. So I'll go deeper into that. So by the way, LRS, which a lot of people might have heard of, is a capital account payment because that's related to investment. Now, if you go into current account payments, I think the next way to divide into further categories is based on who's sending and who's receiving. So there is P2P, that is peer-to-peer. Then there are P2B or C2B and B2B. P2B is when a person is paying a business.
Right.
So the example I took earlier where a European customer is buying from, let's say, a D2C brand in India is actually a C2B or a P2B payment.
Makes sense.
And typically here, the ticket size for most part tends to be smaller, like $10, $100, $500, and so on. And so that's a P2B payment. In India, if you look at domestic P2B payments, by the way, even though we're talking about cross-border, if you scan a QR code on a website or you use a UPI collect call to make a payment on the IRCTC website and so on, that's a P2B payment as well.
Right.
Now let's talk about B2B or business-to-business payments. So in cross-border payments, business-to-business payments is essentially import and export. It's basically trade. So a business in India is, let's say, manufacturing automotive components and selling it to, say, car dealerships in South America. So that's a B2B trade. And that dealership in South America is actually going to make payments to this Indian manufacturing company. And that's a B2B cross-border payment.
Right.
So that's an export payment that this Indian company will receive. So Skydo's focus is purely on B2B cross-border payments. By the way, while I've mentioned this characterization, there are always smaller characterizations possible, as well as some thin lines between themselves. So to that extent, there are different shades of gray as well. But to keep it simple, let's keep this broad categorization of C2B, B2B, and P2P in mind. So as I said, Skydo's focus is B2B cross-border payments. So we're trying to help make trade simpler by taking the pain out of payments for trade.
Right.
Of course, there are several pains in trade. Finding customers is a pain. Manufacturing is a pain. Retaining your labor is a pain. Providing quality services to somebody is a pain, and so on. But getting paid for what you sell or making a payment for what you want to buy, so that there is certainty, there is timeliness, and there is efficiency. Efficiency both in terms of cost and in terms of effort. And then there is also compliance, is not trivial. And depending on which corridor and what kind of regulations it is covered by, it could become super complicated as well. So that's the broad vision why we started Skydo. We want to simplify that all over the world. And it's a huge challenge. It's something that hasn't changed much in the last 10 years. And now coming back to this characterization, P2P and P2B cross-border payments have actually transformed in the last 10 years. So in P2P, there is Instarem, there is Wise, and several other companies around the globe, which have actually reduced the spreads significantly, the FX spreads, and really simplified the process and the experience of sending or receiving payments. Same thing has happened to a lot of extent in P2B. So Stripe, Square in India, Razorpay, and so many other companies, which help, let's say, an Indian brand receive payments from American consumers on their website or on Shopify or on Amazon. I think that has come a long way in the last 10 years. And so we felt that business to business cross-border payments is a space that will get disrupted over the next 10 years, and we wanted to be part of that disruption. So that was the entire background around why we started Skydo and what we decided to do at Skydo.
That's a very detailed coverage of the entire space. So my follow-up question to that would be, what challenges were they facing before Skydo, and how are you able to help them do cross-border payments better?
So within Indian businesses as well, there are multiple segments, multiple categories. You have large enterprises like Reliance or like Infosys that are selling either goods or services outside India. So the challenge for enterprises is very different from the challenge for a small or medium business, where the challenge is not scale. The challenge is actually you don't have resources, you don't have people who are experts at everything. So the founder or maybe one person working for the founder need to actually figure things out almost from scratch and deal with inefficient processes, deal with banks to whom they are not that important as a Reliance and so on, and still get work done at low cost, at low effort, and still be compliant. So we chose to solve particularly for small businesses because we felt that that's where we were best positioned to solve. And the other thing is the rate of growth of trade in India for small businesses is double digit and is expected to remain double digit over the next 10 years. So we were really excited by it and personally also related to it because my co-founder has run one such small business himself for many years.
Nice.
I think coming to your question, so the problems that these small businesses face are multifold. One of them is you have a bank account in some Indian bank. Trust is a very, very difficult thing to establish across borders, particularly if you've never seen each other in person. And now you give them your Indian bank account details, let's say account number and an IFSC code. And this UK-based company doesn't even know what to punch into their, let's say, Barclays bank account interface to make a payment to you. And then even if they are able to do it, they are doubtful about whether the money will actually reach you on time and or if their money will get lost or somewhere along the way it will get stuck and they'll not have anybody to ask. So there are a lot of those stressful situations because most likely the buyer in the UK is also not a large enterprise. And then they would, of course, be afraid about losing their money. They would not have well-set processes of making payments to cross-border vendors and so on. So this entire handshake of how do I even pay you? What are even your bank account details and so on is very cumbersome. Once that gets figured out, then there is a bunch of charges that get deducted along the way for any SWIFT payment, if SWIFT is the channel that you use for making the payment. So there are sending charges in SWIFT, there are correspondent banking charges, and a lot of these charges are difficult to predict. So only once you've made a few payments to the counterparty can you get some semblance of what the charges are likely to be. But even then you can't guarantee. And then because there are multiple banks involved in the process, there's a sending bank, there is a receiving bank, which are two different organizations. And then maybe there are other banks on the way, which are correspondent banks. It's also a very decentralized system, and none of the sender and the receiver might be able to get the full answer as to where did these $200 go and how could they have prevented it or how can they prevent it the next time. And then once the receiver actually gets the money, now they can't use the currency in which it is paid, which is dollars or pounds in this case. So they need to convert it into rupees to be able to then say pay their salaries or buy their raw materials or pay back their loans, etc. So to convert that pounds into rupees, their Indian bank will actually do the conversion. In some cases, the conversion might happen offshore as well, which then is another pain because the conversion might happen at a really bad rate and this person has no control over it. But even if it happens in the Indian bank, typically banks would charge 1.5% to 2% of FX margin on USD INR or GBP INR.
Wow, correct.
So they would typically just end up paying all of those fees. And ultimately, it's the receiver from whose pocket all of this is going. So instead of $10,000, you get $9,800 into an FX rate, which is about, say, 2% poorer than what the rate would have been for a Reliance and so on. So, and if they give a call to the bank, ultimately the bank is also a brick and mortar branch and a relationship manager. And they're all trying to prioritize. They're trying to get work done for their largest clients first and so on. And that again means that they always get the shorter end of the stick in terms of poorer FX rates, in terms of poor service levels, in terms of unclear processes and so on. Almost every step of receiving this payment is cumbersome. And because receiving this payment happens after you've actually satisfied your client or your customer with the goods and services you provide.
Right.
So you're also just trying to get the money into your bank account, and you cannot at that point decide who your client is, which country you're receiving the money from, and so on. You've actually done the business and you want to get paid ASAP.
Right.
So dealing with all of these challenges at the end of one particular transaction is a huge pain. But I think that business which I just described, which is starting exports for the first time or has been doing exports only for the last few years, is the one that we are trying to help at Skydo. So that's broadly the problem statement.
So essentially you're helping them with one visibility, I think, upfront on the charges, right?
Yes.
In terms of when they are receiving, let's say, an inward money transaction from their customers, they know upfront for each currency pair what the charges are going to be.
Yes. So we create full transparency in charges, which means you will not get a raw deal if you don't pick up the phone and negotiate with your relationship manager. You can just rest assured. You might be even on vacation, but you'll still get all your money in your bank account on time. The other thing we do is make it simple for the overseas client to make a payment, because we give virtual accounts to these Indian businesses around the world. So as of now, we give virtual accounts in US, UK, Europe, and Canada. And soon we will add more countries to that list. So if the UK-based client wants to make a payment, they can now use UK's local payment system, which is FPS or BACS. Just like in India, if I asked you to make a payment to me using NEFT or UPI, you'd find it much simpler than sending a payment to me when I'm outside India using SWIFT.
Right.
So just like that, the client now has a lot of convenience. And usually these local payment methods are free of cost or very cheap. And then that also means to some extent that you can get a payment faster, because the client doesn't need to wait for end of the month to run their cross-border vendor payment processes, where they probably have some consultant who's going to come and do it for all the vendors that month and so on. So they can a lot of them can make that payment from their mobile phone and all that stuff. So we add convenience at the client's end. We add cost transparency at the exporter's end. We also add convenience at the exporter's end, because there's no to and fro calls between the bank, relationship manager, and the exporter. There's no email exchange, there's no WhatsApp exchange, and you don't need to visit the branch and so on. This might be funny, but there are banks even today who require you to visit the branch every time you receive a Forex payment. We've dealt with such customers who had this experience and then have moved to Skydo and wondered why they couldn't come across this earlier. So, and then the last part is compliance. So the certificate or the payment advice that I was talking about earlier, we give all of that seamlessly and instantly. You can just download it, you can bulk download it, and so on from our platform.
This is including the FIRC.
So yeah, I would say to summarize, convenience at both the payer and the payee's end, cost transparency and low cost, and third is compliance.
And I think I was going through your website, and you also mentioned that you help with payment reminders and reconciliation there. Again, for those people who may not be aware, virtual accounts helps with reconciliation as well. Do you want to quickly touch upon how easy and simplified that is for your customers?
So about a year and a half back, when we decided to build this company, we didn't know that we were going to build features like invoicing and payment reminders and so on. We just knew that the problems that I mentioned just now are big problems and we must solve them. As we started solving them, we realized that there are processes that need to be done before receiving a payment or before sending a payment, and similarly processes after sending or receiving a payment.
Right.
And those processes are very strongly tied to the act of making the payment itself. For example, the account to which you need to make a payment usually is mentioned in an invoice. Now, if we are issuing virtual accounts, then those virtual accounts need to be mentioned in the invoice, which is what a lot of our users do.
Right.
Now, we said, can we make this simpler for them? Can we make it simple for them to just have all their account information on the invoice without actually having to copy paste? And then there are so many rules around GST, so many rules around what an invoice should contain, should not contain. Very recently, there was this e-invoicing regulation change where the threshold for how large you need to be mandatorily doing e-invoicing was reduced. And because of which tens of thousands of companies came in the ambit of e-invoicing. So we decided to build all of these features to make the overall process before and after payments very simple for our users. I think we've received great response on that, and to some extent it's actually helping us get more customers because people who wanted all of this convenience and wanted some simple system to do all of this are actually pretty happy to use our system. By the way, we don't charge anything for it because we only charge for payments, and that is enough for us to have a solid business model. So the benefit with doing all of this for us is that we don't need to make money on those things. We can actually offer those things for free. They actually make our core product, which is payments, a better product. So for us, we can just offer a basic version of each of those for free. And that basic version is mostly what SMBs need. They actually don't need a very complicated software to do invoicing or to do reconciliation and so on. So that was the learning. But I think for SMBs, nobody's really built the basic version of a Zoho, the basic version of a Tally, and so on. Each of those softwares has decades of CAs growing up, getting trained in those softwares and so on. And then you have to pay them something to bring their expertise and actually do that for you. So a do-it-yourself version, which is easy to figure out and for first-timers and so on, is what we are building.
Fantastic. So now I'm going to put you in the spot, Movin. After having spent years building something on UPI, having seen how seamless it is, taking only a couple of seconds for transactions to go through, for your transaction reference numbers to be generated, how frustrating is it for you to be working in the remittances space where oftentimes payments take days on end? It becomes difficult to track. How high is the contrast and how does that make you feel?
I think how it makes me feel is bittersweet. Bitter because I know it could have been so much better. And I know that what we have today in cross-border payments is probably what we had in domestic payments 10, 20 years back. So sweet and excited because then there is scope for us to build a business and to actually improve this. So there's so much impact to be created. I mean, if I was in the UPI space, kudos to PhonePe and other competitors like Paytm and Google Pay, that in such a competitive space where we are already at perfection in terms of speeds and in terms of success rates and so on, they're still able to build a large business and they're still able to come out with amazing features and engage so many users day on day. If I was in that space, I would not know what to do. Whereas in cross-border payments, there's just so much to do. Almost everything is broken. So that's the exciting part about what I do. But of course, I think the benefit for me is having worked in UPI, I know how much better it can be. And I'm always telling my team to think of that as the gold standard. Until we reach there, there is so much to be done. So if you improve the TAT from 2 days to 1 day, that's not victory. Exactly. Half of the problem is still unsolved.
Are there days or times when you're working that you feel like you could just burn the entire system down and build it from scratch? And that sounds very utopian, but is that a remote possibility that there could be a way for somebody to have a new way of doing cross-border payments tomorrow?
I wish, yes, but I don't think so. So the engineer in me, and that's what I was till 5 years back, the engineer in me would just get frustrated with all of these slow systems and all of these legacy softwares and the processes that banks have and broken frameworks and handshakes and so on, causing all of these delays that I would think, why can't I just write a few lines of code and make a simple system that just works across the board? But I think the wiser me now realizes that the engineer in me is probably also not fully appreciative of the fact that each of these countries and their financial systems evolved over a period of hundreds of years. So what we see today is a result of that evolution. And the world wasn't sort of optimizing for trade and for cross-border payments all this while. Each of them had their own agenda. Each of them had their own culture, had their own country-level objectives, governments, and their own frameworks to deal with financial services and payments. So each of them came up with their way and their banking system, their regulations, and so on. And it makes sense for them, for the most part. So now it's because today global trade is becoming so big and is such a large opportunity for humans. I think now we are feeling the need to have a standardized system and have different financial systems talk to each other and so on. Maybe till even 50 years back, that was not really important. So to that extent, I now sort of understand that this is where it's all coming from, the complication. And in that sense, I don't complain anymore and it doesn't frustrate me. I think I just think of it as an opportunity.
Nice. So that being said, I think I want to ask you, how do you see different money transfer protocols across the world, like PayNow, coming onto UPI? So somebody sitting in Singapore is now able to send money to India in a couple of seconds only because of the connectivity with UPI. How does that play out for you? I know that you mentioned that you're targeting SMEs and SMBs. They would be probably willing to try something like this out. How are you looking at this?
So there are two ways in which I'm looking at this. The first is I'm really excited that this is happening and that governments and public networks like NPCI and PayNow are actually collaborating and talking to each other and innovating on these fronts. I think till 5 years back, nobody was even talking about this.
Right.
So UPI has probably shown the world that it can be done. So a lot of people are now trying to do it. So a lot of people are trying to build their own domestic version of UPI, either in collaboration with NPCI or on their own, or by just getting learnings from NPCI, which is great. And then this PayNow UPI integration type of projects are great for the cross-border payments ecosystem. So the first way in which I look at it is I'm really excited for the future.
Yes.
The second way in which I look at it is when I think about Skydo and what's happening in this space, I think there is still a lot more that needs to be done because, first of all, UPI and any such system have historically focused much more on peer-to-peer payments.
Right.
And now, in the last 2-3 years, they've also focused a lot on peer-to-merchant or P2B payments. I think business-to-business payments is still not their remit. While technically, it is going to require the same type of code to actually move money from a business to business. It doesn't matter. But if you look at it practically, a business has certain processes. A business has certain accounts payable, accounts receivable interfaces. There are invoices. There are loans. There are accountants and there are finance people. There are CFOs who are actually managing all of this workflow. So when you're sending money from one business to another, it's not as simple as scanning a QR and entering a PIN, right? B2B payments are, I would say, a completely different beast. Not to say that the PayNow UPI type of projects will not get there ever. I think they will. But they're solving for P2P and P2M first, is my understanding. Which means B2B is still something that companies like Skydo need to continue working on without much expectation from that ecosystem. At the same time, for example, I am in touch with NPCI and keep speaking to them. I know them well from my time at PhonePe and so on. And keep a tab on this to see if opportunities come up where Skydo could collaborate or contribute.
Yeah.
I think maybe at some point we will see evolution of technologies where the B2B ecosystem can also benefit from them. And I'm actually anxiously waiting for that. I think blockchain and crypto assets and CBDCs are another example of that.
Yeah.
So I think I don't think of that as a disruptive force to what Skydo is building. I feel Skydo is building the last mile where an exporter and an importer could actually exchange money.
Right.
The interfaces where they go to exchange money, getting those interfaces to talk to each other is actually the biggest challenge for Skydo.
Okay.
And I don't think a blockchain or a CBDC can easily solve that. The world needs to completely change their habits overnight for that to happen, which is not realistic.
Yeah.
So that's going to be a slow process, and I'm only looking forward to as much innovation underneath the rails, where a CBDC could actually make the process much more efficient and so on. So Skydo is actually, I would say, raring to ride on those rails to be able to build a better payment system.
Right. It's very interesting that you mentioned CBDCs and blockchain, because in GFF, the RBI created a lot of buzz by kind of talking about CBDCs. I wanted to talk to you about blockchain a little earlier. Probably we could very briefly touch upon it. Like, how do you think it's going to help businesses? On a scale of 1 to 10, how excited are you about that? Because cryptos and blockchain are reimagining building possibilities and how payments can be done.
I think on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say my excitement is 7. I'll tell you why it's not 10. Because unfortunately, we ended up creating a huge buzz around these terms, which was not warranted. And now that correction is happening and that hype cycle is coming down. So the only way in which these technologies can realize their true potential and create the true impact that they were meant to create is if they're able to actually now come out of this down cycle of hype and actually prove their worth, right? Which a lot of good people are actually trying to, but there's also a lot of negative perception. By the way, the reason why I'm excited is that those technologies at the very basic level do have a lot of potential. I think one particular thing that I have noticed, by the way, I'm no expert on blockchain, so I'm sure there's a lot that I don't know. But the one thing I've noticed is that just because there is now a technology called blockchain and everyone is talking about it, governments and banks and regulators, central banks have started to take notice and have started to at least think about what they can do using this. And they don't want to be out innovated. They don't want to get disrupted. I mean, at some point, people were even talking about the central banks are going to be a thing of the past and so on. And I think they just, all of them suddenly rose from their seats and said, okay, let's figure out what's happening and let's make sure that it doesn't suddenly kill us. And I think that's a great thing that has happened, because of which now the entire ecosystem is actually figuring out what could have been much better than what was happening earlier. And that innovation is good for everyone, I think. The other slightly controversial opinion that I have is that actually a lot of the problems which people are ascribing to blockchain and saying blockchain will solve this. I mean, on Twitter, a lot of jokes also keep doing the rounds as to let's solve this using blockchain. I feel actually a lot of them are just doing the basics better and could have been solved without blockchain as well. And there are exceptions to this too. But I just think that blockchain is giving people an excuse to rethink those basic problems which people had earlier taken for granted. And in some cases, even without blockchain, we might be able to solve them. But the good part is that at least people are rethinking.
So while I asked you that question, I personally don't believe that businesses will adopt to any of these technologies from a collecting forex or collecting remittances point of view. I don't really see cryptos can take off. All of these technologies can have a lot of adoption, but at the same time, businesses are very legacy in terms of their reporting, in terms of their accounting, in terms of how they pay taxes. So you could probably go and buy a cup of tea on the roadside by paying to some very tech-forward chaiwala. You can pay him in ETH and you can pick up a cup of chai, but I don't think you'll be able to pay for your Uber ride, or you won't be able to buy something off Flipkart by paying through any of these methods today. So it's still very much deeply embedded into these financial traditional systems.
Right.
But the blockchain can fundamentally bring in efficiencies into systems which may be broken to enable processes in the back end of these forex transactions to happen better.
Yep.
So that's something that's exciting for me. But again, I'm a newbie when it comes to these kind of things in the back end. So yeah, would love to hear a payment expert talk about it one day. I had two more questions before we jump into the next segment. Having been in the payment space, both you and I, we are very familiar with chargebacks and all of these payment rails being used to collect money for fraudulent activities. You're now giving rails to SMEs in India to collect money from other countries. How does this work for you? Has any scammer been smart enough to figure out a use case like this, and have they been caught yet?
So I think we are very conscious of this use case at Skydo and want to make sure that we're helping the financial system in India and globally in being wary of these scammers and making sure that they get caught or they get detected.
Right.
I think at Skydo, we've deployed some of the best risk management and transaction risk monitoring systems, and we've got a great team that is taking care of compliance and risk. We have come across at least one or two cases where there's been some complaint from the overseas buyer that they were scammed or they were not happy with their purchase. And as Skydo, we've done our best to facilitate redressal of such cases and to make sure that the scammer, if they actually are not able to use our platform in the future and are also reported to the right authorities. And then, by the way, just like in India, we have zero MDR. In the US, nobody even talks about it. And the reason for that is card chargebacks. Ultimately, if you have a card, as a small merchant, you're actually going to be charged a higher MDR because the card company or the acquiring bank doesn't understand your consumer profile and is going to assume the worst. And when they assume the worst, they're going to price in the highest level of risk. Right? So that's actually anti-small business.
Correct.
So as I sort of came into payments and particularly cross-border payments, I started realizing the kind of negative impacts that this fraud has. Now, and that's why I really appreciate two-factor authentication, even though maybe a few years back it was frustrating for me to have to enter an OTP every time. So coming back, different financial instruments have slightly different levels of responsibility for risk management because cards is a completely consumer thing. Maybe a teenager is using a card. Maybe in India, similarly, UPI has a very high responsibility for this because maybe somebody who doesn't know English is using this and so on. I think there are other instruments which have slightly lesser risk of fraud. For example, Skydo mostly deals with ACH, FPS, and so on, where a business is sending money to another business. This is not a $10 transaction. It's typically a few $1,000s. And such transactions usually happen after a few bilateral conversations.
Okay.
The kind of fraud that might happen there is, let's say that the level of purity of the goods that are getting shipped is not up to the mark and so on. Or the shipment doesn't reach on time, or the quantity is not enough and so on. It's nobody can tell you to just enter an OTP at the wrong place and so on, right? So the kind of fraud is very, very different in B2B.
Right.
And hence, I think at Skydo, our attempt right now is, I think that's the advantage the focus on B2B payments gives us, that we don't have to think about the consumer fraud. Of course, there is a thin line between consumer and business also at some point. But our main focus is on figuring out what kind of frauds can happen in B2B trade and then eliminating, detecting, and reporting them.
Makes sense. So who has jurisdiction over a fraud that could take place on your platform?
So this is a great question, particularly when it comes to cross-border payments. There is no single jurisdiction on any transaction. Because the buyer and the seller are in different countries ruled by different governments, different regimes. You cannot say that the entire transaction is ruled by one of those. Because if there's an importer in the US and an exporter in India, the US government, the US regulator, the US central bank are all responsible for what is the experience of this buyer in the US.
Right.
They are interfacing with their financial system, not with India's financial system. And similarly, same set of responsibilities the Indian government, the RBI has with this Indian seller or exporter. And then at some point, one bank in the US and one bank in India are talking to each other. That brings a lot of challenge in cross-border payments because there's no single protocol. And by the way, companies like Ripple and others are actually trying to create exactly that protocol, which is globally accepted. And that's the reason that people think there's a lot of promise there, but it's also not something that can happen overnight because adoption is not going to be that easy. But I think, so to answer your question, each of the central banks, each of the regulators is involved. And any transaction needs to abide by rules of each of them. You cannot ignore anything. By the way, even if that money travels via Europe, US to India via Europe because of some correspondent bank in between and so on, then even Europe's rules come into effect. Right? So that's how complicated cross-border payments becomes from a regulation and even from data privacy and all those points of view, which again makes it a super challenging and super exciting space for us because you can do so much using technology when such challenges are involved. Exactly.
Yeah, interesting. What's your take on NPCI becoming the global leader when it comes to remittances going forward?
I think NPCI is doing a great job in India right now. They're a good set of people led by a great vision. Also, their control is slightly decentralized. So in that sense, they're an organization that can be trusted. I've worked with them and I think that they've got some great minds driving the organization. So I would be more than happy to see them driving the global remittances agenda and efficiency in the cross-border payments ecosystem. Of course, it's going to take many years because when NPCI was building UPI, while in hindsight, we can say it is easy. I shouldn't say it was. But definitely the challenge of bringing multiple regimes and multiple regulators together was not there.
Makes sense.
Right? They had to bring the Indian government, the Indian regulator, maybe the Indian technology ecosystem, maybe the banking ecosystem together, which is not easy.
Right.
But consider doing that for 50 different countries, right? It is a whole new beast. So I think that remains to be seen. I have high hopes that they will move faster than we can think of. But it's definitely going to take a lot of doing, a lot of effort and some miracles.
So shifting gears, Movin, I think we've spoken a lot about the environment that we're operating in and the technology that runs these machinery. Let's focus on your journey as an entrepreneur. In your journey building Skydo, have you learned from any mistakes that you made in terms of just being a founder?
Yes, I think I've made a ton of mistakes and I do that all the time. I think one is as you transition from an individual contributor to a leader and then to a leader of leaders, it's important to not be a control freak and to understand that people are doing their work with the best intention and are people who you should trust until they do something wrong or until they break your trust. So by default, do not try to control. just give context and that's
Right.
it. So context, not control, is the sort of keyword here, and which I now live by. So just give context, motivate them, show them the vision, make them dream what you are dreaming, and then let them do it. Right. So I think that also makes your job as a leader very easy, because now you can actually sort of let the team do most of the stuff, and you don't have to tell them each and everything as a singular instruction.
Right.
You actually just tell them a grand vision and then let them sort of run with it.
Yeah.
Of course, this needs very high talent density also, so it kind of puts the onus back on you as a leader to hire good people and hold them to a high standard and to give them feedback whenever they don't uphold that standard. Then I think the next mistake that comes to mind is, being a very geeky techie, I used to think, build a great software and the world is going to line up for it.
Right.
So I have at least a couple of times in my career built stuff without really thinking who the user is or what exactly is the problem that I'm solving for them.
Right.
Are they looking for a solution to that problem? Is it such a big problem? Do they perceive it to be a big problem? If they're looking for a solution, where are they looking for a solution? When are they looking for a solution? Are they willing to pay for their solution? And then, let's say I build this product, how am I going to make sure that thousands or hundreds of thousands of such customers actually come to use this product? So all of these questions, I think the fact that these questions need to even be asked is something that I learned after making this mistake a couple of times. Maybe the last thing that comes to mind as a mistake is, one of my mentors said, there's no cure for a small market. So if you start up in a small market, there's a chain of things that need to go well. If even one of them doesn't go well, which it won't, because in business, not everything will go your way. If even one of those things breaks, there's probably nothing else you can do, because it's a very small market. So that's another thing which I think we were acutely aware of, both Srivatsan and I, when we started Skydo. And that was one of the reasons behind the choice of starting a cross-border payments company.
Makes sense. I think obviously having had the privilege of working in companies which have really defined spaces and having had first-hand experience of how these founders have driven it, I'm sure you'll know a lot of pro tips or hacks on how to build a business, right? And then more than the mistakes and more than the learning from there, you've probably had that experience, which obviously I'm very envious about. But what are those tips, Movin?
I think
what worked?
One of the things that comes to mind is that when you're hiring, you and by the way, this is contextual to the current market, so it may not work at all times. But in this slow market where there is some good talent out there who's actually not able to get jobs ASAP, and people don't normally have 5 offers in their hand and so on, it's actually better to wait for talent to get excited by you and come to you, rather than go out aggressively and pitch to everyone and so on. I think, by the way, it's not just a hiring strategy, it's a way of running the company. I think the other thing, given the slow market, be frugal and make sure the quality of execution is very high. Don't make very costly mistakes and so on. Having a measured approach is actually helping us.
Absolutely.
So we love this market. Of course, there are negatives to it, that you have to wait for investors to be excited enough, and you have to reach a different level of metrics to be able to get investors excited. But I think other than that, I would say that I'm actually enjoying this market where people are being very, very thoughtful. And we've also built that kind of a team who's thoughtful and who's not just taking rash decisions and saying, okay, we just have to grow at whatever cost and so on. And a lot of these people have actually come from other startups where they've actually suffered because of that attitude. I mean, I've been at some as well. So I think those frustrations have actually taught us to do better, and that is serving us well.
Focus on the fundamentals. Nice. What's the macro environment looking like for you guys? Is it headwinds? Is it tailwinds? No winds at all? Like, what is the scene?
I would say mild tailwinds.
Okay.
Luckily, tailwinds have been there in cross-border payments for the last 2-3 years, maybe even more, particularly in India, but I think globally as well. I think there are quite a few iconic cross-border payments companies which have obviously made a lot of money for investors and have become very large businesses. PayPal comes to mind, Wise comes to mind, and so on. And then a few that have blazed the trail over the last few years and become unicorns like Neum. So we look up to all of them. And I think investors have learned from the success of some of these companies that this is probably a space that still has many more years left for new entrepreneurs to come and build. So I think that way we've been lucky. That also affected us in our seed fundraise that right at the beginning of our journey, we were able to raise a decently large round from a very good set of investors. But I think those tailwinds, just because of the macro market, have slowed down. And that is why I said mild tailwinds now. I think there's also been a slew of cross-border payments companies that has come up. Some of them direct competitors, some of them adjacent, and some of them not really competing. But I think that's only a good thing because they're increasing awareness in the market.
Yeah.
We are also able to learn from their mistakes. Hopefully they can learn from our mistakes as well. And because of that, hopefully we are also able to draw attention of the ecosystem, like the regulator, the banking world, to this space and the problem statements that we are trying to solve. So in that sense, it's good. I think because the tailwinds are not very strong, because just like I earlier said, a measured approach helps. But we've also seen that then raising the next round is not something that's trivial. And you actually have to have numbers to show, you have to have customer traction to show, which I think we've been very lucky that we've got initial good PMF and are seeing good numbers.
Right.
But I think this market will separate the good from the average.
Right.
So that's something I'm quite excited about.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you're focusing on what matters and you're being very, I think, sensible in where resources are being spent, I think good market to be building in, right? I mean, slightly discounted valuations in the short term, but good, at least if we survive the next year and a half, I hope there are good times ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah. Awesome, man. As a founder in this space, what excites you to get to work every day?
I think for me, great colleagues is number one. And then a very large multi-year and probably multi-decade problem to solve is another. I think the great colleagues part has also been one of my learnings so my previous startup, it didn't go exactly as expected. There was a point at which we had to pivot because we realized that we were working on a problem that didn't exist and so on. But throughout all of those mistakes, throughout those upsets, the one constant thing was that I still enjoyed that journey because I had a great co-founder and we are still close friends. We could confide in each other and we could get frustrated in front of each other and so on. So I think, and hence I don't regret any of that, right? I really learned and benefited from it.
So as a founder operating in the space, what are some frameworks or hacks that you've implemented which has really worked in your favor? And also, if you want to call out any AI-driven tools that you've been using that's kind of 10x your productivity or just made your life better. Let's have a quick chat about that.
Yes, I think I'm a very simple old school person. So the tools that usually work best for me are Google Drive and Google Docs and Google Sheets and Whiteboard and good old meeting rooms and so on. But I think there are a few tools that we've recently started deploying which have helped increase productivity or made us more creative and so on. I think so. For example, in terms of producing content and being active on social media, we're using a lot of AI not really to write stuff, because I feel that AI doesn't do a great job there. I mean, original content is original for a reason, right? But for example, fact checking or grammar checking and so on, it definitely makes the team more productive. In terms of even coming up with the schedule, those kinds of things, we are still researching and still trying to get better because the space is also evolving every day. Other than that, not really. I mean, I'm not a big fan of tools and frameworks, so I typically just try to keep things simple. I just think it's better to stick to the basics. That's what we've done so far.
Nice. I mean, this entire conversation has been so exciting for me because we've been able to explore so many different aspects and it's evolved as we've gone about. So very, very invigorating conversation. Thanks for this.
Same for me, Raunak. I think you've covered a breadth of topics and made me share quite a few interesting stuff. So I think very interesting conversation. And I think all the best to you for this podcast. And I'm happy to have contributed. Thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Fintech Quotient's Spotlight. Do share your feedback, thoughts, ideas, and even your fintech stories with me. Your feedback will help us to do better. Our social media handles are plugged in the description below. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, don't keep it to yourself. Spread the fintech fever by sharing this podcast with your friends, colleagues, and anyone passionate about fintech. Until next time, Keep those insights flowing, and let's build the future of fintech together.